My name is Daniel Michael Harper, and before everything in my life unraveled, I was a man who believed deeply in order, commitment, and long-term promises. At the time this story begins, I was 34 years old, serving as a staff sergeant in the United States Army, stationed in Texas, though I was originally born and raised in Dayton, Ohio. The military had been my career since I was 19, not because I lacked options, but because I wanted structure and purpose. Years of service shaped the way I thought, spoke, and trusted. I was 6 feet tall, broad from constant training, disciplined in routine, and careful with money and decisions. I believed that if you worked hard, stayed loyal, and followed the rules, life would eventually reward you with stability. If you love ruthless revenge stories packed with shocking twists, like this video and subscribe now. New, never-before-seen stories are released here every day, each more intense than the last. I met my wife, Emily Carter, when I was 26 and she was 24, in a way that felt ordinary at the time, but later became haunting in hindsight. We were introduced at a casual backyard gathering hosted by a mutual friend in Austin, Texas, not far from Fort Cavazos, where I was stationed then. Emily worked as a real estate administrative assistant, and she immediately stood out because of how confident and composed she seemed. She had a warm smile, spoke with certainty, and asked thoughtful questions that made me feel genuinely seen. We talked for hours at evening about work, goals, and family. She told me she admired discipline and stability. I told her the Army taught me both. It felt like alignment. Our relationship moved steadily rather than recklessly, which is something I took pride in. We dated for nearly 2 full years, during which I learned her habits, her ambitions, and her frustrations. Emily wanted financial security, a comfortable life, and a future that felt predictable after years of instability growing up. I wanted partnership, loyalty, and someone who understood the demands of military service. She attended unit events with me, met my fellow soldiers, and spoke openly about how proud she was of what I did. When deployment came up in conversation, she assured me she could handle it. I believed her because I wanted to. Love has a way of filtering out doubt when you're invested enough. We got married when I was 28 and Emily was 26, in a small but meaningful ceremony attended by close friends and family. There was nothing extravagant about it, but at the time, I thought simplicity reflected sincerity. Before we married, I already owned a 3-bedroom house purchased through a VA loan, something I worked years to qualify for, and a black 2018 Dodge Charger that represented one of the few indulgences I allowed myself. Emily moved into my home after the wedding, and we talked endlessly about building a future together. She planned to move up in real estate, and I planned to finish my service with a stable family waiting for me at home. Professionally, my life was predictable and structured. The Army dictated my schedule, responsibilities, and progression, and I thrived under that system. Emily's career was more fluid, involving assisting agents, managing listings, and coordinating client schedules. She often spoke about wanting more, about eventually becoming a licensed agent herself. I encouraged her and supported her financially when she talked about taking courses. From my perspective, we were a team. I handled long-term planning, savings, and major decisions, while she handled day-to-day home life. I never imagined that this division of responsibility would later be used against me. When my deployment orders came through, IT wasn't unexpected, but it was longer than previous ones. 9 months overseas. The night I told Emily, she cried and held on to me tightly, telling me she didn't know how she would manage without me. I reassured her, reminding her we had survived shorter deployments before and that this sacrifice was temporary. I set up automatic payments, organized documents, and gave her access to our joint account strictly for household expenses. I believe preparation prevented problems. What I didn't prepare for was intentional betrayal. I kissed her goodbye believing I was leaving my life in trusted hands. The weeks leading up to my departure were filled with emotional promises. Emily told me she would wait, that distance wouldn't change her feelings, that she understood the weight of my service. She told friends she was proud to be a military wife. I carried those words with me when I boarded the transport flight, believing I was leaving behind a marriage strong enough to survive absence. I thought loyalty was mutual, that marriage was a contract stronger than convenience. As the plane lifted off, I had no idea that while I was preparing to serve my country, the foundation of my personal life was already beginning to crack in ways I couldn't yet see. At that moment, I still believed my story was one of sacrifice rewarded by love. I believed that home would remain home no matter how far away I was sent. I believed my wife and I were aligned in purpose and values. Those beliefs shaped every decision I made going forward. And that is what made what came next not just painful, but devastating. Deployment has a way of stretching time until days blur together, and weeks feel like months. Once I arrived overseas, my life settled into the familiar rhythm of military routine, early mornings, long briefings, patrol preparation, and the constant awareness that mistakes carry consequences far beyond personal failure. Despite the intensity of the work, my emotional anchor was home. I counted time not by mission schedules, but by when I could hear Emily's voice again. At first, we talked often. She would tell me about work, complain about small inconveniences, and describe ordinary moments that grounded me. Those conversations gave me a sense of normalcy, a reminder that while I was deployed, my real life was waiting patiently back in Texas. During the first 2 months, Emily made a visible effort to stay connected. She sent photos of the house, updates about her job, and messages that ended with reassurances of love and loyalty. She talked about missing me, about sleeping on my side of the bed just to feel closer. I took those words at face value, replaying them in my head during long nights when sleep was hard to come by. I shared details of my days cautiously, not wanting to worry her, and focus on reminding her that everything we were enduring was temporary. In my mind, we were doing exactly what military couples are taught to do: communicate, trust, and endure. As time passed, the tone of our communication subtly shifted. The calls grew shorter, sometimes rushed and often postponed. Text messages that once carried warmth became practical and brief. When I asked how she was doing emotionally, she would deflect, saying she was just busy or tired. I told myself this was normal, that everyone handles absence differently. I rationalized the change by blaming work stress, loneliness, or even my own imagination. The idea that something was fundamentally wrong felt incompatible with the woman I thought I married. So I ignored the quiet unease building in the back of my mind. Financially, everything appeared stable on the surface. The joint account I set up for household expenses showed activity consistent with utilities, groceries, and minor home costs. Nothing looked alarming enough to raise suspicion. I had always been meticulous with money, but deployment limited my ability to monitor things closely. I trusted that Emily understood the boundaries we agreed on. My house, my car, and my personal savings were never discussed as shared assets. They were the result of years of disciplined planning, and I assumed marriage didn't change the legal clarity of that reality. Trust, I believed, eliminated the need for constant verification. There were moments, however, when something felt off in ways I couldn't articulate clearly. Emily would sometimes sound distracted during calls, as if her attention was divided. Background noises felt unfamiliar. When I asked direct questions, she reassured me quickly, sometimes too quickly, and changed the subject. I remember one call where she mentioned rearranging furniture, something that seemed harmless at the time, but later took on a different meaning. I dismissed my concerns because acknowledging them would have required confronting the possibility that my trust was misplaced. And at that stage, I wasn't ready for that. The deeper irony of deployment is that while you operate in environments defined by risk, you often feel safest emotionally. Everything is clear: objectives, ally threats. Home, on the other hand, becomes abstract, filtered through phone calls and digital messages. That abstraction makes it easier for reality to be reshaped without your knowledge. I believe that my absence was simply a pause in our shared life, not an opening for transformation. I believe that vows carried weight regardless of geography. That belief allowed me to focus fully on my duties, unaware that the foundation I stood on was quietly being altered. Around the fourth month, communication became inconsistent enough that others noticed. Fellow soldiers asked why I seemed distracted, why I checked my phone more often than usual. I brushed it off, telling the marriage was complicated long distance. Inside, though, a quiet anxiety had taken root. I found myself replaying conversations, analyzing pauses, and wondering why reassurance felt less convincing than before. Still, I never accused her of anything. Accusation felt disloyal, and loyalty was something I still held sacred. I believed that if I stayed patient, everything would correct itself once I returned home. What I didn't understand then was that patience, when met with deception, doesn't preserve relationships. IT enables damage. While I focused on completing my deployment honorably, Emily was slowly rewriting the story of our marriage without my consent or awareness. The distance between us wasn't just physical anymore. It had become a gap in truth, one that widened every day I chose trust over scrutiny. By the time the first undeniable sign appeared, the damage had already gone far beyond emotional neglect. At that point in the deployment, I still believed the hardest part of my journey was happening overseas. I thought the danger lay in the missions, the environment, and the uncertainty of war. I had no idea that the real threat to my life, as I knew it was quietly unfolding back home, under my own roof, involving the person I trusted most. That realization hadn't reached me yet, but it was closer than I imagined. The moment that shattered my illusion did not arrive with drama or warning. It came quietly, in the form of a simple message, on an otherwise ordinary day in the middle of my deployment. I had just finished a long shift and was sitting alone, scrolling through my phone, when notification from an old friend back home appeared. He was someone I had served with years earlier, someone who still lived near my house in Texas. The message was short and casual, but it hit me with a force I still feel when I think about it. He asked, "Hey man, random question. Did you sell your black Charger?" In that moment, my stomach dropped in a way I had never experienced before. I stared at the message for a long time before responding, convinced there had to be a misunderstanding. I replied simply that I had not sold my car and asked why he was asking. A few minutes passed that felt like hours, and then my phone vibrated again. This time, there was a photo attached. It was my car, unmistakably my black 2018 Dodge Charger, parked in my driveway. But what made my chest tighten was the man standing next to it. He was lean, confident, and completely at ease, his arm resting casually on the hood as if it belonged to him. IT wasn't just my car anymore. IT was my life, being occupied by a stranger. My first instinct was denial. I told myself there had to be an explanation that made sense, some detail I was missing. Maybe Emily had a friend over. Maybe the photo was old or misleading. But the deeper I looked, the more obvious it became that this was not a coincidence. The man's body language spoke of comfort, not visiting. The time stamp was current. And most damning of all, my friend confirmed he had seen the man coming and going from my house for weeks. In that moment, the quiet unease I had been ignoring finally took shape. IT wasn't anxiety anymore. It was reality. I called Emily immediately, my hands shaking as the phone rang. She didn't answer the first time, or the second. By the third attempt, my heart was pounding hard enough that I could hear it in my ears. When she finally picked up, her voice was calm, too calm, as if she had been expecting this conversation. I asked her directly who the man was and why my friend thought I had sold my car. There was a pause on the line, long enough to confirm my worst fears before she even spoke. When she did, her explanation was disjointed, defensive, and filled with half-truths that collapsed under their own weight. She told me she had sold the car because she needed the money and claimed she had the right to make that decision as my wife. When I asked how she managed to sell a vehicle that was solely in my name, she deflected and changed the subject. When I asked about the man, she said he was just staying temporarily, and that I was overreacting. What hurt most was not just the lies, but the confidence with which she delivered them. She spoke as if my absence had erased my authority over my own life, as if deployment had stripped me of my rights and my dignity. After the call ended, I sat in silence for a long time, trying to process the magnitude of what I had just learned. My wife had sold my car without my consent, using a forged signature. She had moved another man into my home, a home I owned long before we were married. And she had done all of this while I was serving overseas, believing I was powerless to stop her. The betrayal cut deep, but what followed surprised even me. The anger did not consume me. Instead, IT sharpened me. Years in the military had taught me one crucial skill: how to remain calm under pressure and act strategically when everything is at stake. I began documenting everything immediately. I saved messages, requested copies of the vehicle sale, and contacted legal assistance through my unit. That was when I learned just how badly Emily had misjudged the situation. As a deployed service member, I was protected under federal law, including the Service Members Civil Relief Act. Her actions were not just immoral, they were illegal. The sale of my car, the unauthorized use of my property, and her attempt to establish a new domestic arrangement while I was deployed all carried serious consequences. She had assumed distance meant invisibility. She was wrong. What Emily didn't know yet was that her lawyer was about to discover the full extent of her mistakes. I had not been served with any divorce papers, but I learned through legal channels that she had already consulted an attorney and attempted to move forward without disclosing my deployment status. That omission alone was enough to cause panic on her end once it came to light. At that point, I was no longer a husband trying to save a marriage. I was a soldier protecting his rights and his future. By the end of that day, I understood one clear truth. The life I thought I was already gone, but in its place was something else: clarity. I no longer questioned my instincts or doubted what I was seeing. The betrayal was real, and so were the consequences that were coming. Emily had made her choices in my absence, believing I would return too late to do anything about it. What she didn't realize was that this was only the beginning. The first call from Emily's lawyer came early in the morning, at a time when most people back home were still asleep, but my day was already well underway. I was preparing for duty when my phone vibrated with an unknown U.S. number. At first, I considered letting it go to voicemail, but something about the timing made me answer. The voice on the other end was tight, controlled, and strained in a way that immediately told me this was not a routine call. He introduced himself as Robert Klein, an attorney representing my wife, and before I could say much of anything, he asked if I was currently deployed and if I had legal representation. That question alone confirmed everything I needed to know. He spoke quickly, carefully choosing his words, explaining that there was serious oversight regarding recent actions taken by his client. He never used Emily's name at first, as if distancing himself from her decisions might somehow limit the damage. I could hear papers shuffling in the background, his breath slightly uneven, the sound of a man who had just realized he was standing on legal quicksand. He asked whether I had been informed about the sale of my vehicle and the current living arrangements at my property. When I confirmed that I had just recently become aware, the silence that followed was heavy and uncomfortable. He then said the word that changed the entire tone of the conversation: deployment. Once he acknowledged it formally, everything shifted. His confidence drained, replaced by caution, and something that sounded very much like fear. He admitted that Emily had not disclosed my active deployment status when she initiated legal consultation, and that certain actions taken in my absence were now problematic. That was a gentle way of saying she had put both of them in serious jeopardy. The Service Members Civil Relief Act was not a technicality. It was a wall, and she had run straight into it. As he continued speaking, I said very little. Years of training had taught me the value of silence in high-stakes moments. He explained that the sale of the vehicle, if completed without my authorization, could be considered fraud. The occupation of my home by a third party without my consent while I was deployed complicated property rights. And any attempt to move forward with divorce proceedings without proper disclosure could result in sanctions against both client and counsel. Each sentence sounded less like a negotiation and more like damage control. He was no longer calling to assert a position. He was calling to contain a disaster. When I finally spoke, I kept my voice even and measured. I told him I was aware of my rights and that I had already contacted legal assistance through my unit. I informed him that all communication would go through my representation moving forward. That statement hit harder than any accusation could have. The power dynamic shifted completely in that moment. He no longer spoke as a lawyer dealing with an absent spouse. He spoke as a man who knew the law was about to scrutinize every move his client had made. Before ending the call, he asked if I would consider an amicable resolution. I did not answer that question. I didn't need to. After the call ended, I sat still for a long time, letting the reality of it all settle in. The panic in his voice had not brought me satisfaction, but it had brought confirmation. Emily had believed that my absence made me vulnerable. Instead, IT had exposed her. The law was not on her side, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt grounded. Not vindictive, not triumphant, just steady. The chaos she created was no longer mine to manage alone. Systems exist for a reason, and now they were moving. In the days that followed, the calls increased, but none came directly from Emily. Everything was filtered through attorneys, each message more carefully worded than the last. Requests for pause for time for discussion filled my inbox. I responded only when necessary, always through proper channels. From what I learned, the man living in my house had left abruptly once he realized the legal situation he had walked into. My home, which had been treated like a prize, was suddenly a liability no one wanted to touch. The confidence that had once defined Emily's actions was gone, replaced by urgency and regret. That chapter of my life marked a shift I could never undo. I stopped thinking of myself as someone waiting to return home and start fixing things. I was now someone preparing to reclaim what had been taken. The lawyer's panic had been the first real sign that consequences were coming, and they were coming fast. Emily had played a game she didn't understand, with rules she never bothered to learn. And now, for the first time, she was about to learn them the hard way. Returning home after deployment is supposed to feel like relief, like exhale after months of holding your breath. For me, IT felt more like stepping into the aftermath of a storm that had already passed, leaving damage in every direction. When I finally landed back in Texas under approved leave, I did not go home immediately. I met first with legal counsel assigned to military assistance, going over documents, timelines, and evidence with the same discipline I would apply to a mission briefing. Every detail mattered. Every decision I made now would either restore what I had lost or complicate it further. I was no longer operating on emotion. I was operating on facts. The first time I drove back to my house, I parked across the street and sat there for several minutes without moving. The place looked familiar and strange at the same time, like a memory that had been altered without your permission. The lawn was overgrown, the windows bare, and the driveway empty where my car should have been. When I unlocked the door and stepped inside, the air felt wrong, heavy with the presence of people who should never have been there. Furniture had been moved, personal items were missing, and the house no longer felt like the home I had left behind. It felt temporary, like a place someone had used without respect or care. Emily was not there. By court order, she had been required to vacate the property pending legal resolution. Her belongings were mostly gone, but she had left behind traces of hasty decisions and poor judgment. Documents were scattered in drawers, including copies of paperwork she never had the authority to sign. As I walked from room to room, I felt a strange mix of anger and closure. This was not a space I wanted to reclaim emotionally, but it was one I had to reclaim legally. It was mine, and that fact was no longer up for debate. Court proceedings moved quickly once my deployment status was formally entered into the record. The judge did not mask his displeasure with what had occurred. The illegal sale of my vehicle was invalidated, and Emily was ordered to repay the full amount from the sale, along with additional penalties for fraudulent misrepresentation. The buyer, who claimed he had no idea the signature was forged, was required to return the vehicle and the title was reissued in my name. Watching the system correct what had been so carelessly broken was sobering. It was not satisfying in a triumphant way. It was necessary. The divorce proceedings themselves were brief and uncomplicated once the facts were established. Emily's attempts to claim marital rights over assets I owned prior to the marriage were denied. The court recognized a clear pattern of deception and bad faith actions taken during my deployment. She did not contest the final terms. By that point, her legal team had shifted from aggressive posturing to damage mitigation. The confidence she once displayed had completely evaporated, replaced by a quiet resignation that spoke volumes. Outside the courtroom, the consequences continued to unfold. Emily lost her position at the real estate firm after the fraud became known. Professional reputations do not survive public records easily, and her actions had created a paper trail she could not escape. The man she had moved into my home disappeared from the situation entirely, unwilling to face any legal or social fallout. In the end, everyone who had benefited from my absence abandoned the mess they helped create. I was the only one left to clean it up. What surprised me most was not how much I lost, but how much clarity I gained. I no longer questioned whether I had done enough or trusted too much. I understood that betrayal is not a reflection of the person who is betrayed, but of the one who chooses it. Rebuilding my life did not mean returning to what was before. It meant accepting that some things, once broken, are better left behind. The house could be repaired. The car could be recovered. But the marriage was already over long before the court made it official. By the time the legal matters concluded, I felt something I had not felt in a long time. Peace. Not happiness, not relief, but peace. The kind that comes from knowing where you stand and what you will no longer tolerate. I had left for deployment believing I was temporarily stepping away from my life. I returned understanding that I was stepping into a new one built not on assumptions or promises, but on truth, boundaries, and hard-learned self-respect. When everything was finally over, when the court papers were signed, the house was quiet again, and my name stood alone, and unchallenged on every legal document that mattered, I expected to feel triumph. Instead, what settled over me was something deeper and more lasting. It was a sober realization that surviving betrayal does not turn you into a victor. IT turns you into someone who sees clearly for the first time. I was no longer the man who believed good intentions were enough to protect a life built on sacrifice. I had been forced to accept that character is proven not by words spoken in comfort, but by actions taken when no one is watching. Returning fully to military duty after the divorce felt different than any deployment I had ever completed. This time, I was not leaving something fragile behind. I was standing firmly in my own life, with clear boundaries and a hard-earned understanding of where my responsibility ended and where another person's choices began. My fellow soldiers noticed a change in me, even if they could not name it. I spoke less about the future and more about the present. I no longer assumed loyalty. I observed it. Trust became something earned over time, not granted automatically because of a title or a promise. The house, once a symbol of stability and then a betrayal, became neutral ground again. I rearranged it, not to erase the past, but to mark a new chapter. I removed what did not belong to me, both physically and emotionally. I did not rush to fill the silence with new relationships or distractions. Instead, I allowed myself to sit with the quiet and understand it. For the first time in years, my life was not shaped around someone else's expectations or demands. It was shaped around truth, routine, and intentional choice. Emily never reached out to me directly after the divorce was finalized. Any communication that occurred went through attorneys and eventually stopped altogether. I did not seek closure from her because I learned that closure is not something another person can give you. It is something you claim when you stop asking questions that have no honest answers. I no longer wondered why she did what she did. Her actions had already answered that more clearly than words ever could. Acceptance did not come all at once, but it came steadily, built on facts rather than hope. What stayed with me most was a lesson about power and absence. I had believed that being away made me weak, That distance reduced my ability to protect what I had built. The truth was the opposite. My absence did not create the betrayal. IT revealed it. It stripped away appearances and excuses and left only choices. That understanding changed the way I viewed both relationships and service. Sacrifice does not entitle anyone to loyalty, but it does reveal who is capable of it. Today, when I think back on that deployment, I no longer see it as the time I lost my marriage. I see it as the time I gained myself back. I am still a soldier. I still believe in commitment, in discipline, and in standing by your word. But I no longer believe that love is proven by endurance alone. It is proven by consistency, honesty, and respect, especially when it is inconvenient. Those values guide every decision I make now, both in uniform and out of it. If there's one thing my story taught me, IT is this. You can lose possessions, time, and even people you once trusted completely, and still walk away with your dignity intact. While I was deployed, my wife sold my car and moved in another man, believing distance would protect her from consequence. What she did not understand was that the truth has a long memory, and the law has a long reach. I did not win because I fought harder. I won because I stood still, let the facts speak, and refused to surrender my self-respect. That, more than anything else, is who I am now. If you enjoyed this story, hit the like button and leave a comment letting me know what you thought. And if you're not already subscribed, please subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss new stories like this one. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.